Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dinecco. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for discussions of miscarriage and child death.
The Love Canal neighborhood near Niagara Falls, New York, is the site of an environmental disaster caused by decades of improper storage of chemical waste that resulted in illnesses and death among many of the residents who later settled there. This terrible tragedy was completely avoidable if not for legal loopholes and a lack of understanding about environmental toxicology before and during the early years of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the lack of responsibility taken by chemical companies like Hooker Chemical, who originally used the land as a dumping site despite knowing the risks associated with handling their chemical waste. Eventually, Love Canal would be the first Superfund site designated for intense chemical cleanup by the EPA, but only because of the efforts of citizens, mainly the residents of Love Canal itself, and by and large because of the stay-at-home mothers who demanded action on behalf of their families and neighbors. The origin of Love Canal dates back to the industrial dream of railroad entrepreneur William T. Love that first broke ground in 1894. Niagara Falls had been used as a hydroelectric plant supplying electricity to the Midwestern United States for about a decade at this point, and Love wanted to build a canal from the upper Niagara River, which would go around the falls and enter the lower river, providing not only electricity, but also transport to a portion of land he called Model City. This was supposed to merge cutting-edge power technology with utopian design by doubling the output of electric power in the area, which would bring in more money and more investments. He promised that the residents of Model City would all have electricity, phone lines, gas, water, and sewage system, all of which are commonplace now, but back then not everyone had that or could even dream to have it all in their homes. His investors at the time believed in his dream and gave him enough money to begin digging part of his canal, but they didn't know that they were investing in a Ponzi scheme that predated Ponzi himself. Love got people to invest in Model City as future residents and used their money to pay back people who had already invested. And as usually happens in these schemes, Love went bankrupt, and then he moved out west in 1897. Love's canal was never finished, Model City was never built, and by 1910, the Niagara Falls area had a huge abandoned gash in the earth near the upper Niagara River that no one quite knew what to do with.
I never knew this.
Yeah, I think they don't like this.
They don't love this origin story.
Yeah. And the Hooker Chemical Company started out in Niagara Falls and was one of many chemical companies that sprouted up along Chemical Row in the 1920s, only about 5 miles from Love's Canal. Initially, Hooker produced chloride lime and caustic lime to produce chlorine, but eventually expanded into pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides like Murex, as well as chlorinated hydrocarbons generally. They produced DDT and polyvinyl chloride, chemicals which have the potential to create hazardous byproducts like dioxins, which is the same chemical widely dispersed during the Vietnam War in solutions of Agent Orange. During World War II, Hooker started producing more chemicals than ever before. In fact, they had ties to the Manhattan Project, and one of their executives personally witnessed the atomic tests on Bikini Atoll. But producing more chemicals meant they were producing more waste than ever before and needed somewhere to store it. And so they purchased the land in 1943. I mean, thankfully this meant that they weren't dumping their waste in the river, at least not all of it. Instead, the waste was stored in 55-gallon drums, stacked 20 or 30 feet high in the canal, and then buried under 4 feet of dirt. It was supposed to be covered in clay, but that layer was never added at Love Canal, at least not over the whole thing. There were no laws or regulations about chemical disposal at the time, and we pretty much let the companies decide what was best.
And of course they had, everybody's best interest at heart, right?
Totally.
Right?
Totally they have, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we're just better living through chemistry, and that involves waste, and we're doing the best that we can with this waste. Yeah. They actually did. They got a city permit to do this. Like, they purchased the land, and then they got a city permit to bury waste there. And then they buried 22,000 tons of chemical waste over a period of 10 years. It was a lot of fucking waste.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a lot. Like, how much room do they have left after this 10 years? Like,
I mean, they used the whole canal. Like, they used the whole expanse of the gash there. And they did it in sections. So sections of the canal were divided, drained, and dammed. And then they would fill it with drums. And then once that was filled, they would do the next section. But they were producing so many chemicals that sometimes they would put in 1,000 drums a day. And it wasn't uncommon that these drums would already be corroding before they reached their burial mound, and then they would break open and pour chemical waste directly into the soil.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
What could go wrong? And when the chemicals splashed onto the workers' clothes and skin, they would flee to nearby houses to ask residents to spray them down with a garden hose because they knew, like, the danger or the possible danger of being exposed to these chemicals.
Yeah, like, they knew, like, they weren't being, like, they weren't naive to what was going on.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, and they knew that if the chemicals contacted water when they were dumped, they could burst into flame. And so in 1949, the fire department was actually called out to the canal when one of these fires caused the whole thing to ignite, and it took 4 hours to put it out.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so it's, like, not a, like, small thing. Like, it's a pretty big deal, and there are these known dangers, and if there's these known dangers, it's like, well, what are the unknown dangers? I wonder what they could be.
Right.
So in 1953, Hooker filled the canal, and the chemical waste was sealed. Only a few months later, in April, the Niagara Falls School Board purchased the land from Hooker Chemical for $1. The school board didn't know anything about chemicals and toxic waste, but Hooker did, as we were just saying. And with chlorine as their specialty, they actually offered to make chemical weapons during World War I, as well as the protective equipment against chemical weapons. Like, they know what the dangers are.
Yeah.
So there's no room for any argument for them to say that they didn't assume that the ground would be dangerous to inhabit. The deed that the company drew up actually read,
"The premises had been filled, in whole or in part, to the present grade level thereof with waste products resulting from the manufacturing of chemicals by Hooker Chemical, and Niagara Falls assumes all risk and liability incident to the use thereof."
In short, should any problems arise in the future, that's the city's responsibilities, not the company's. You get what you pay for.
Yeah, they're washing their hands of it completely.
Completely, yes. So the city immediately set to work building, and I cannot believe this is the case, building the 99th Street School directly on top of the dump site.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Growing bodies, what could go wrong?
Like, the only thing that I could imagine would be worse is if they were like, we're specifically putting a nursery.
A nursery. That's what I was just thinking. Like fresh babes.
Yeah.
From the womb. Like,
from the womb, yeah. We're going to have our labor and delivery unit here.
Yeah. Like, oh my God.
The foundation of the first building actually sank into a pit of chemicals because the ground was settling on top of these thousands of pounds of busted-ass waste drums. And so they had to move the building 30 yards north, which was still directly on top of the dump site, but it was a little bit more stable there. So, like, it's a couple years since this thing has been covered, and it's already starting to settle, and things are already starting to happen. The school opened in 1955, and by 1960, a neighborhood was built around it, whose backyards faced the school and sat atop the edge of the old dump site. During development of the additional housing in 1961, another fire broke out at the dump, and fumes stripped the paint off of the finished homes.
Nothing to raise alarm bells, right?
No. It's that happens all the time, right?
Right.
And the developers knew what they were building on top of. When the school board sold sold these portions of the land to these developers in 1957, they told them that, quote, due to chemicals having been dumped here, the land was not suitable for construction. And this was in part because they were worried about the effects of the liquid and solid waste on the water lines and the sewer lines and the impact that it would have on building foundations, like it did with the first school. So even if we didn't have unified laws and regulations about the disposal of chemical waste and environmental contamination, people understood that there was some sort of associated risk with that. It's not a case of not knowing any better. They had some idea that it could be dangerous. And it's actually during this time that we as a community around the world, and especially in the United States, start to get really concerned about the impacts of human activity on the environment. Because 1957 was the same year that the federal government began spraying the insecticide DDT aerially to eradicate the destructively invasive spongy moth. And a group of Long Island farmers sought an injunction to stop the spraying, which may actually be the first modern environmental case brought by citizens in the U.S., but they lost their court battle. And during the ensuing, appeals and all of that, they inspired conservationist and marine biologist Rachel Carson to begin researching DDT. And the fruits of her labor were published as the book Silent Spring in 1962. One of her arguments was that it was a conflict of interest for the USDA to regulate pesticides at the same time that they promoted the concerns of the agricultural industry, because the USDA does not give consideration to wildlife or anything that exists outside of the concerns of farming and logging. And although her work was derided as biased, communist, and the hysterical writings of an unmarried feminist, it inspired the deep ecology movement and got the attention of the White House, such that the Nixon administration established the EPA in 1970.
It wasn't for nothing.
It wasn't for nothing. I mean, it got Nixon's attention.
Right.
Probably the one good thing that he fucking did, right?
Right.
So this new agency absorbed the duties of the National Air Pollution Control Administration, the Bureaus of Solid Water and Water Hygiene, the Federal Water Quality Administration, and then it also took on the duties of pesticides, radiation criteria and standards, and ecology research from portions of other agencies. So all of these were all spread out, but now this new agency has to take on all of this. Carson, unfortunately, didn't live to see the impact of her work, since she died from breast cancer just 2 years after the release of Silent Spring.
Oh, that's tragic.
I know. But so, this is kind of the backdrop of what's going on before Love Canal really gets identified as Love Canal. Back in Niagara Falls, the houses were built on the land sold to the developers by the Board of Education, and the concerns about the landfill beneath their feet slipped silently into the past, and chemical manufacturing was viewed by and large as a positive asset to the community. By the 1970s, the Niagara Falls region was synonymous with chemicals. According to Love Canal resident Lois Gibbs, who lived 2 streets away from the 99th Street School,
when you smelled chemicals, you smelled a good economy. You knew that you were going to be able to put food on the table. You were going to be able to pay your mortgage. You're going to be able to buy a new car someday.
Hers was one of 800 families who lived in the neighborhood surrounding the school. Gibbs and her family moved there in 1974 and considered themselves lucky to be able to afford their own home on an acre or so of land per house, thanks to the government offering subsidized housing with mortgage rates of $135 a month. As far as I can tell, the average mortgage payment around this time was $236 or so. So Love Canal gave them a home they could afford on her husband Harry's wages from the nearby Goodyear factory while she stayed home with her 2 young children. On 95th Street, there was a housing project that included an apartment complex called Griffin Manor with 240 units, as well as the LaSalle Senior Housing Development, where most of the elderly folks in Love Canal lived. Although housing project might be the wrong term for it, because Griffin Manor was actually a pretty nice place to live in, unlike some of the half-assed multifamily housing developments that are in other places, because it had plenty of green space for kids and pets to play in. It had large units with up to 5 bedrooms to accommodate larger families.
Oh, wow.
But these were spaced out evenly throughout the complex so that resources wouldn't be swamped by the large families, so it wasn't all large families who were all trying to get laundry done on the same day.
Mm-hmm.
And the complex was also integrated without questions or concerns. And this was in a time when it was still really difficult for Black families to find nicer places to live. It was 60% Black families by the 1970s, making the development one of the most diverse locations in Niagara Falls. The Gibbses and their neighbors were happy to live in a neighborhood mostly made up of young families with young children like theirs, with a school and a playground nearby, even if no household seemed to be able to keep a family pet alive. But that was a minor issue, right?
Okay. No alarm bells at this point.
Just a little red flag. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
It's fine. It's fine.
Kind of the same with, the mortgage. It's like, why is the mortgage so low in this area?
Yeah, why is it almost half the price?
Maybe just don't think about it.
They just have big hearts. They just have big hearts.
Yeah. And kids also loved the unique features of their very fun neighborhood, like the swamp that they called the Black Lagoon because of the oily green-blue sheen on the surface of the water. Anything that fell into the lagoon didn't slip in, but sat on the surface, bubbling before it sank.
Oh.
According to the residents who played there as kids, it smelt like burnt rubber and a strong chemical cleanser, and it would burn the rubber off the soles of their shoes.
Fuck.
Other parts of the neighborhood also had a strong chemical odor. The oily swampland wasn't confined to a single part of Love Canal, and some homes had stinking black ponds just beyond their back fences. The residents just got used to the stench, and for some of them, it was the smell of work or their loved ones who worked at the chemical plants in town. But the mail carrier took to wearing a gas mask when making rounds in Love Canal.
Could you imagine seeing your mail person walk up with a fucking gas mask on?
I feel like as a new resident, that would be another red flag. Like, why?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why are they doing that?
Yeah, I can't keep my puppy or my kitty alive.
Mm-hmm.
My kids come back with fucking holes in their shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm seeing the male person with a gas mask on. Where am I?
Right. The kids also had fun playing with pop rocks in their neighborhood.
Oh, Lord.
Which were black rocks that they'd rub together to watch them catch fire. There were also soft white rocks, which some of the kids noticed could be used as chalk because they fell away and left their mark so easily when rubbed on the concrete. But one child went temporarily blind, and others experienced burning in their eyes after playing with this kind of rock. When kids ended up with chemical burns or the smells got too bad or black goo seeped into the basements of homes, local authorities would come out and investigate. And despite finding organochloride insecticides and polychlorinated biphenyls in test samples, no one thought that anything really needed to be done until the blizzard of '77 hit. 4 times the amount of snow fell that winter, starting around the holidays in 1976, and much of it came down in a January blizzard that was the worst storm in Niagara Falls history. All told, they got about 17 feet that winter.
Oof.
And when all of the heavy, wet snow finally melted sometime in May, it brought some of the buried barrels and their chemicals to the surface. Others collapsed under the weight, creating dangerous toxic sinkholes in people's yards full of foamy or tar-like stinking black gunk. The gunk then began to seep into the basements of several private homes, as well as the basement of Griffin Manor. A toxic lake had also sprung up near Griffin Manor, as it sometimes did in the wet season, that was 3 blocks long and 4 feet deep in sections, and when kids skipped rocks off the surface of the water, they sparked like fireworks. People were also starting to become ill in ways they couldn't ignore anymore, like the rashes they'd had for years on their hands and feet, rashes that were usually only seen in factory workers. And also, wasn't it odd how many people in the neighborhood had cancer diagnoses? And why had so many pets died so young? Residents asked for help from local politicians but dismissed their concerns because they didn't want headlines about chemical pollution to impact tourism in Niagara Falls. Only Congressman John LaFalce, the rep for the Niagara Falls region, listened to what they were saying. He wanted to conduct more testing to see what was going on. The Calspan Corporation conducted a months-long examination of the area and delivered its findings to the State Department of Environmental Conservation in the summer, but the test results were marked confidential and were not released until the following year. Their tests of groundwater showed chemicals had leaked from the dump, including polychlorinated biphenyls and hexachlorobenzene, and their presence indicated a clear environmental hazard. But it was believed that these chemicals could be contained by using submerged pumps to reduce groundwater runoff and adding a better clay cover like the one that should have capped the dump site to begin with. Since no answers about the testing was forthcoming to the public, in the summer of 1977, LaFalce wrote to the head of Hooker Chemical to learn exactly what was buried in the Love Canal dump site and if it could be dangerous. But the company refused to release that information because it was considered a trade secret.
Okay, so I get trade secret stuff. This isn't a trade secret when it is affecting an entire population of people.
Right. Yeah.
Like, nice try. So what did he do with this?
He couldn't really do much. He kind of was just like an annoying fly that was easily swatted and shooed out of a window, compared to some of the other issues that Hooker Chemical was dealing with at the time. For 2 years, David Axelrod of the New York State Health Department had been trying to hold Hooker responsible for dumping their fire ant poison Murex into the waterways. He had already conducted $200,000 worth of tests in the state lab to confirm the presence of Murex in Lake Ontario, and then managed to successfully ban fishing in the lake from 1977 to 1978 because of the chemical contamination. Hooker, of course, ran their own studies to try and discredit Axelrod, and they set up endless meetings with him to waste his time. Eventually, even the president ended up on the phone with him, but the discussion devolved into accusations that Axelrod was emotionally unstable, and then the president made a thinly veiled threat toward him by saying that the fight had only just begun before slamming the phone down.
Wow.
So they weren't very concerned about LaFalce at the time. There was discussion between LaFalce, the city, and the EPA about some of the abatement plans to clean up Love Canal, and they had assumed at this point that it would take approximately $400,000, and everyone was kind of hoping that the EPA would pay for it, but his calls there went ignored as well.
Oh.
At least by the people who controlled the purse strings. They did send out an engineer to conduct an official EPA study, and he was absolutely dismayed at what he discovered. The ambient air of the neighborhood contained detectable amounts of benzene, which is a known human carcinogen. Also, the EPA realized during this testing that there was another dump site near the water plant for the city that they hadn't known was there before.
Yeah, why not put a fucking water plant where they're dumping chemical waste?
Yeah.
Like, why not?
Why not shit where you eat? It's fine.
Yeah.
So part of their job as a young agency was to find these kinds of sites that had been established long before they were on the scene. And by now they were aware that the number of these sites in the United States was in the thousands. But they weren't really sure how many were in the Niagara Falls region alone. But later, the number they landed on would be 38 sites spread over 400 square miles. And none of them but Love Canal sat directly below a school and residential homes. The EPA engineer concluded that a full-out fix on the canal would not cost $400,000, but would cost closer to $1 million, and that estimate was on the conservative end. In the meantime, the safety of the residents needed to be addressed, and his report stated,
"Serious thought should be given to the purchases of some or all of the homes affected, resulting in the homes being torn down and the basements filled in."
Local experts were growing impatient with the government's inaction, especially microbiologist Joseph McDougall and his consultant Richard Leonard. Both men were concerned that not knowing what was in the ground and not knowing how it impacted human health could mean extreme danger for the people of Love Canal, especially the children who played on the playground and baseball diamond directly above the collection of collapsing drums. Their concerns were also ignored, and the 99th Street School reopened on schedule that fall and intended to stay open the entire school year, though they did tell students not to walk in the fields surrounding the school during wet weather.
Kids always listen, so I'm sure that was fine.
Yeah. It's not like they've already been playing in the skunk to begin with.
Right. For years, like, and, like, the damage has been done at this point. Like,
Totally.
Actually, like, even if they did plant, like, they're already screwed.
Right. As far as anyone whose specialty was not in chemistry was concerned, this was just life in Love Canal, and they could learn to deal with it as they had always dealt with it, with the presence of chemical companies and their emissions. Lois Gibbs's son, Michael, started to get sick around 1975, after they'd been living in Love Canal for about a year. First, he developed asthma, then a urinary disorder, but when he entered kindergarten at the 99th Street School, his health worsened. Gibbs didn't know about the barrels beneath her son's school. She just knew that suddenly he was having problems with basic worksheets and appeared to have gone colorblind in the fall of 1977. In December, his problems worsened when he had an unexplained seizure. His doctor prescribed him medication, and Lois had to hope that that would help, but she began to wonder if there was something she had missed. Results from more preliminary tests, this time conducted at the state lab, landed in LaFalce's office in early 1978, labeled confidential, meaning their horrifying results had to be kept from the very people being impacted by them. The old canal and at least 14 homes showed alarming levels of chemicals, many of which were carcinogenic. Chlorotoluene and trichlorobenzene were detected in the living rooms and dining rooms of homes at low concentrations, but the basements had concentrations of some 42 halogenated compounds that exceeded exposure rates for factory workers at chemical plants by hundreds of times in some cases. The government couldn't publish the findings they had received, but word still got out because the people reading them were terrified. Eventually, a reporter at the Niagara Gazette named Michael Brown heard the murmurs about toxic waste at Love Canal and began publishing what quotes he could get from people like Richard Leonard. The state health department where Dr. Axelrod worked ordered the county health commissioner not to just clean up the canal and make it safer for habitation, but also to conduct an epidemiological study on the residents. They'd found at least 82 different compounds in the soil now, 11 of which were known to cause cancer. It was
one's not bad enough.
No, we need 11 before
we need 11. Yeah.
Ugh. It was time to stop testing the area and start doing something. Before the commissioner could respond to all this, Michael Brown made it front page news. People couldn't keep ignoring the issue any longer. Lois Gibbs read these articles and began putting the pieces together about what was going on in her neighborhood. Michael continued to have seizures, and she was worried he was going to get worse. She requested that he be allowed to relocate schools, but for political reasons, because if I let your kid move, everyone in the county is going to want to be able to move their kid if they don't like a school too, they denied her request. She felt powerless, and she knew she had to do something. So her brother-in-law, Wayne Hadley, was an assistant professor in biology, and she'd gone to him when she first started reading Brown's articles to ask his opinion, like, hey, this Brown guy is saying that there's some sort of, like, toxic waste underneath Michael's school. Do you think that could be related to his condition? And he was like, yeah, I think you need to do something. Like, if you feel stuck and you feel like you can't do something to help your kid, that can't be the case. There has to be something that you can do. And he told her that public officials might not listen to her as one mother representing one family, but he might listen to her if she could get all of the mothers together to represent all of the families.
Power in numbers. I like it.
Now, Gibbs was a shy and kind of nervous woman. She didn't think very highly of herself because she only, had a high school education, and she was just a housewife, and she didn't feel like she had all that much authority. So going door to door in her neighborhood to ask personal questions wasn't something that she thought she could do. But Hadley was like, you have to do this. It's not just your kid. And to her surprise, few people slammed their doors in her face or even laughed at her asking if they'd sign a petition to shut down the school. While she was going door to door and asking people these questions, she was suddenly becoming a historian and recorder for her neighborhood. Debbie Surreal lived on 97th Street for 7 years, and in that time she'd experienced 5 miscarriages. She had 3 children under the age of 8 who suffered from skin problems and persistent nosebleeds. Her backyard became an oily, stinking black pond when it rained, and the family's Irish setter Casey died from bone cancer. Luella Kenny lived on 98th Street. That summer, her youngest son, John Allen, who attended a private school in Niagara Falls, was plagued with swelling in his face and was given an antihistamine that didn't help him feel any better. A second doctor told her that his distended abdomen was from swallowing too much air. But her normally lively child remained lethargic all summer, with barely even enough energy to walk from place to place. Patty Grenzy on 100th Street had 2 daughters under 3 who suffered from breathing problems and mouth sores for the entire 2 years they'd lived in the house. After she listened to what Lois Gibbs had to say about the lot the school sat on, Grenzy became nervous for the 3rd baby she was pregnant with and confidently signed the petition. Ann Hillis moved to 102nd Street in 1965 and suffered a miscarriage in 1967. She now had a son who attended the 99th Street School but suffered from migraines and severe diarrhea. And it really can't be understated that the women became the face of the movement to do something about Love Canal. The women were in the home the most often because fewer of them worked than their husbands. They were the ones taking care of their children and picking them up from the school. They were the ones suffering directly from miscarriages and stillbirths, and they were the ones who had the time and the freedom to attend the public meetings that were held. They were held at night, but many of the husbands worried that showing up and being too vocal could cost them their jobs at the nearby chemical plants. So while men were present and their work was important, it was overwhelmingly women who were doing the work. But even with 161 signatures on her petition, the city and the school refused to listen to Gibbs. During one public meeting in June, an attorney for the city schools told her the board didn't put the chemicals there, and even if it did, it doesn't have the financial capability to do anything about it. On top of that, they were insisting that the school was safe at these public meetings, though behind closed doors, Albany was beginning to sweat. The school wasn't safe, and all of their years of piling more topsoil onto the lot was making things worse in the neighboring yards, where the runoff collected chemicals. They couldn't ignore the results of health surveys on the residents that showed higher than normal numbers of miscarriages, allergies, acne, respiratory illnesses, and cancers. But they could tell them that it was nothing to worry about. After Lois Gibbs got dressed down at the meeting in June, Wayne Hadley started to ask around at SUNY Buffalo if any experts would be willing to help. And only one person volunteered. It was Dr. Beverly Pagan, who was a goddamn angel of a human being. I love this woman.
Okay.
Her doctorate was in biology, and she saw herself as a scientist and an environmentalist in the vein of Rachel Carson. Dr. Pagan organized the first Earth Day in Buffalo and published an annual list of the 12 worst polluters in the area.
Okay.
And she also knew what it was like to be the mother of a sick child, because her child had just been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And so she sympathized with the plight of the families in Love Canal. In August of 1978, the state health department declared a health emergency at a public meeting in Albany and ordered an evacuation, but it was extremely narrow in scope. Pregnant women and children under 2, among the 200 families in the first 2 rings around the canal, so up to 2 streets away from the school, needed to leave immediately and relocate into surplus military housing. But everyone else should just stay and just avoid their basements and not eat anything out of their gardens.
That makes me feel safe.
Right.
Very safe. Like if I'm one of those other families.
Like pregnant women shouldn't live here, but you can.
Yeah, like, oh, cool. I'll just go about my day now like nothing's wrong.
Right. And also, the 99th Street School is going to delay opening in the fall. So don't worry, it's going to delay. Why? Is it going to open in December? Like,
Yeah, like
what are you
nothing
telling us?
is. Yeah, like what's gonna magically happen in those like 5 months? Like, please.
Right. And I don't know how they didn't anticipate that this just served to make the residents angry. Like, the residents don't know everything, but they're like, okay, we know enough to know that you know something. Why hadn't something been done earlier? And why are you doing so little now? Like, are
Mm-hmm.
3-year-olds okay to live here? Like,
Right,
you know?
right. Like, yeah, they're fine. They've grown enough. They've experienced enough life.
Yeah, it's
Like,
fine. So this meeting was in Albany. People in Love Canal hear about it, and they take to the streets in protest. They were shouting interviews to international news reporters. They were taking their mortgage contracts out and burning them in the street.
uh,
And they blocked a road near the school. So now there's a united force of us versus them, the residents versus the state, until everyone is evacuated. But it wasn't totally united. Lois Gibbs, as the presenter of the petition and the first instigator, became the head of the Love Canal Homeowners Association, which was not an HOA in the traditional sense. This was just grouping everyone in the neighborhood. But the title seemed to leave out Griffin Manor, whose residents weren't homeowners. And Lois Gibbs actually explicitly said that she wanted to represent everyone impacted. Like, Love Canal is everyone in this neighborhood.
right, like just because they're renters doesn't mean that they like don't suffer from the consequences of this situation. Like,
Totally.
like what the fuck?
But not all of the homeowners were as generous in their thinking as Lois Gibbs. So it was really easy for the homeowners and the media to disregard the renters because, you know, they were not tied down with mortgages. And they were also primarily black compared to the primarily white homeowners. So now you have this, like, racial divide.
Race component, yeah.
Yeah. Some of the owners resented Gibbs for even trying to include Griffin Manor, and others resented her as their representative because she was in what was called Ring 3, which is everyone 2 streets from the school out. Like, there's 1, 2, and then 3. Like, it's like, what? You just do Ring 1 and then everyone else.
Right.
But she wasn't considered to be in danger by the government, and so why are you representing us? And it's like, okay, she's in danger, and you are really, like, dismissing that?
Yeah, like, you're... Oh, my God. Like, she's a street away, okay?
Right.
Like, please.
Right. So it got pretty tense at some of the public meetings, and homeowners were actually yelling things like, you know, renters should get out and stop complaining, and if they wanted to be heard and taken seriously, then they needed to buy a house, which was like, okay, how well did that work out for you?
Wait,
you know?
so they really were being like this?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
And that was some of the nicer things they said.
Like, they were totally sarcastic.
No, they were for sure, and there was definitely some like racial slurs being thrown around. It was not good. And it was worsened. This whole situation was worsened because the lawyer who filed the paperwork to define the HOA made no mention of the renters. So even though Gibbs was like, no, it's everyone, the homeowners association only represented the homeowners. It didn't represent the renters at all. So they basically had no representation at these meetings. And it's not as if they weren't also being poisoned, like you said. Aline Thornton had raised 6 children on 93rd Street. Her third child, Gregory, died of leukemia before his 2nd birthday in 1961. But no one had written down her story about it. No one was asking about how the 2 children living in her home were doing. Dorothy Atkinson lived in Griffin Manor for about a decade, but was on 99th Street prior to that. She could remember the fires breaking out when the trucks dumped the barrels into the canal. And now her daughter, who went to the 99th Street school, regularly suffered from dizzy spells. Sarah Rich lived in Court 4 in Griffin Manor with her 2 kids, as well as a nephew, a niece, and her 79-year-old mother. And the household had a slew of health problems, from eczema to kidney infections to asthma. And the renters didn't have mortgages, but they were just as stuck as anyone else. Because like I said before, the units in Griffin Manor were large, accommodating many more people than typical apartments. How are they supposed to easily up and leave? What was the likelihood that they could afford to move and pay rent for a new place? Many of them felt lucky to have gotten a unit in a complex as Black families with so little difficulties, so could they expect the same elsewhere? But everyone was facing the same problems with the dump. In fact, some of the units in Griffin Manor were closer than the houses in the proposed evacuation area, but they were being excluded. What were they going to do for the babies of the evacuated pregnant women, even if they survived birth?
Right.
Although the sample size was small, Beverly Pagan's assessment of the birth defects in Love Canal revealed that their mothers were 8 times more likely to give birth to a child with congenital defects than the average American mom.
Ugh.
LaFalce worked hard to do more. He worked with the EPA and New York Governor Carey to get President Carter to make an unprecedented declaration. Love Canal was not just a health disaster, but an environmental disaster like an earthquake, and needed to be treated as such. But Carey, fresh off a recent win, was too enthusiastic in his approach. He told the residents that they would no longer have to make mortgage payments and that everyone in a contaminated home would have the option to sell. If they wanted to, they could just abandon their homes now. And this was not the plan that had been made with President Carter before Governor Carey announced this.
Right.
Lois Gibbs was flown out to Washington to strike a compromise. Rather than only focusing on pregnant women and young children, the government was willing to help everyone in Ring 1 and 2 to evacuate by covering rental expenses at $300 a month for wherever they moved, as well as moving expenses up to $400. And they planned to find some $8 million to purchase the abandoned homes. Money wasn't the only resource needed, of course, and evacuating all of these families to hotels around the area put a strain on Niagara Falls. Hotels didn't have any room for the tourists that officials had wanted so badly not to impact.
Ugh.
But what about Ring 3?
Yeah.
Literally everyone else 3 streets back, accounting for approximately 700 families. What about Griffin Manor and the LaSalle Senior Housing Development? As for the latter, they decided that they needed to also have someone speak on their behalf, as Lois Gibbs did for the homeowners. So their representatives were Eileen Thornton and Agnes Jones, and their group, the Concerned Love Canal Renters Association, was actually supported by a local chapter of the NAACP. Jones took down the histories of the renters and found that there were also rampant numbers of people who fell ill as a result of living in Love Canal. In both the Renters Association and the HOA, the people leading the fight were primarily women and mothers going up against male officials and CEOs and scientists who didn't take them seriously. But unfortunately, only Gibbs and her homemakers made it to the news night after night. Still, behind the scenes, the lawyers for both groups were working together and collecting information to file a lawsuit on behalf of all of the residents for $16 billion. In the meantime, a chain link fence was erected around Ring 2.
Because that's going to fix everything.
Homes on Ring 3 literally faced the fence, which represented the government's opinion that everything behind it was dangerous and everything on the other side was safe. Chemicals totally pay attention to chain link fence.
They pay it. Not only do they pay attention to the chain link fence, but it's like, did they really think that this was a solution?
I know.
Who thought, that's just wasted money, in my opinion.
I know. They wasted so much more money than if they had just evacuated everyone.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
And so now, everyone in Ring 3 gets to live around this ghost town. And inside the evacuation zone, they didn't have plans to, dig down and remove all the barrels and remove the waste. They were going to just try to cap it with clay. But they still needed to remove all the trees and the brush and the above-ground swimming holes in the garages. And they needed to, tear down the houses and fill in the basements. And they also wanted to dig trenches on either side of the canal and then line them with clay pipes that would funnel that contaminated groundwater to a holding tank. And so there was going to be a lot of work that was done, and residents worried that more chemical fumes would be released into the air when the remediation plan broke ground. Or, even worse, they were very worried that the digging with backhoes and stuff would cause a spark, against one of the barrels,
Oh, fuck.
and the highly
Yeah.
volatile chemicals would explode.
Well, yeah. I mean, when they're skipping rocks, like the kids were skipping rocks
Yeah.
and it caught fire. Like, yeah, I would think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was a valid concern.
So people protested the remediation and they created blockades to keep the workers from coming in. Others refused to sell their houses to prevent the digging from taking place on their land. You know, they're trying to think of the people in Ring 3 who are still there, and they're like, you're not just putting the people who are still living here at risk, but you're putting these workers that you're bringing in at risks. And the officials were like, that's not likely. Like, it's going to be fine, but here, we'll give you a compromise. At the expense of $7,000 a day to taxpayers, the state sent a convoy of 60 buses to run all day on street corners in Love Canal. In the event that Love Canal exploded, families were expected to run to these buses, which were expected to wait for everyone, and then they would be whisked away from the burning rubble. That's the state's plan.
Okay.
And they actually had them do like a dry run where they had everyone run out with their kids and practice grabbing the important paperwork they need. Yeah.
Like, that is scary. Like, could you imagine?
No. There's so much fucking PTSD that they are seeding right now. And it's like $7,000 a day to keep these buses running, pumping leaded gasoline into the air of this fucking neighborhood.
Right.
Like, is this the cheaper option than just being like, you know what? I think maybe we should just cut our losses and evacuate everyone.
That's what I'm saying. Like, how did they think that this was the fiscal option? Like,
right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So Aline Thornton thought this was a stupid idea and that it was not any sort of compromise. Both she and Jones insisted that more testing needed to be done on the people in public housing, and they demanded immediate action in that regard. By fall, 200 chemicals were identified in the area, and some of the children were showing liver abnormalities on their health screenings, and yet there was no move to evacuate anyone else. And there was no testing that was being conducted on the people in the public housing. Many of the residents didn't have an education beyond high school, but they knew that the officials in power were only looking at data and not listening to what they said. Basically, they were saying, yes, you were exposed to this, but at this level, and that is a concern, but it doesn't mean that you'll get, like, this specific outcome, which, like, is totally true. Like, just because you are exposed to something doesn't mean that something will happen to you, and we've talked about that before.
And that's fair, but, like, at these levels, even to the layperson, like...
Right. Well, and they're saying, okay, but you're saying that this is a known symptom or a health issue of being exposed to this chemical, and surprise fucking surprise, we have these symptoms, so, like, isn't that a cause for concern? And so... they're like, okay, we need to learn how to read the data to back up our anecdotal evidence because you're not fucking listening to us. And Lois Gibbs in particular worked hard to educate herself about the different chemicals that were listed on the readouts. The rocks that blinded that one kid and caused burning eyes in the others were contaminated with lindane, an insecticide that was also found during the 1978 testing. Initially, it was used as a scabicide for the treating of scabies and head lice in humans around 1947. However, the first indications that the chemical was toxic not only to arthropods but also humans came as soon as 1953. Lindane is lipophilic and can enter the white matter of the brain, and so the majority of side effects from exposure are from the neurotoxicity, including mood and behavior changes, ataxia, disorientation, tremors, seizure, and death. And this can occur in children even from the recommended 1% topical solution prescribed for scabies treatment. Maternal exposure to lindane during pregnancy and breastfeeding has resulted in stillbirths and mental retardation in the children. Chronic exposure can result in impaired liver function, cardiac arrhythmia, changes in menstruation, and possibly certain types of cancers like leukemia. In 2002, California banned the pharmaceutical use of lindane, although it is still used in other locations. Unsurprisingly, lindane is also a long-lasting, potent environmental pollutant, which we discovered only after we'd been using it for several decades to fumigate fruits and vegetables. Acute toxicity has been seen in aquatic wildlife exposed to lindane and is known to bioaccumulate in both terrestrial and aquatic animals. These problems are not limited to animals living near chemical plants or agricultural areas that have used the pesticide. Lindane particulates and vapor can release into the air and are known to move to both warmer and colder regions, and some lindane has been detected in Arctic air and animals. In 2007, the EPA banned it as a commercial pesticide. The OSHA and National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health have both limited skin exposure to 0.5 milligrams over 8 hours in a single week. But the amount found in the soil where people lived, worked, played, and gardened at Love Canal was 20 million milligrams per meter cubed.
Okay, so I was reading the notes and I just read it as 20 and I was like, okay, 20 is bad.
Yep.
I didn't realize that the capital it meant fucking million.
20 million. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I double-checked this number a couple times because I was like, did I miscalculate something? No.
Right.
No. They are limiting it to 0.5 for workers, and there was 20 million in the soil at Love Canal.
Wow.
The recommended disposal technique for lindane is also now incineration, not land burial. And this is to avoid releases into the air, soil, and water. While the lindane pesticide perhaps was not meant to leak from its barrels, some environmental contamination was not likely seen as an issue in the 1950s, since it was applied to fruits and vegetables in agricultural settings. But polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, were never meant to be released into the environment. Rather, they were produced for use in capacitors and transformers. Like the dioxins, PCBs are not one thing, but are a group of 209 similar chemicals, and the most popular ones were sold as Aerochlor by Monsanto. 2 years before the testing at Love Canal revealed PCBs in the soil and water, the Toxic Substances Control Act banned the production and use of PCBs because of their own environmental toxicity. Once in the environment, these very stable and inflammable compounds do not break down and can cycle through air, water, and soil. These chemicals are so pervasive that they have also been found in the Arctic and are present in any living person in an industrial country. The metabolites of PCBs can induce cellular injury. Exposure to them can result in acne and rashes, GI distress, depression, fatigue, and liver changes. They are potential occupational carcinogens, including liver cancer. Fetuses can be exposed to PCBs in utero, which can result in issues with motor skills, memory, and immune responses in babies after birth. Because this is a group of chemicals, they have a range of toxicities, so there's not a single number I can pin down to demonstrate the toxicity for the whole group. But a 54% solution of chlorodiphenyl has an OSHA limit of 0.13 parts per million, and at Love Canal, the soil contained total PCB amounts of 2 to 6 parts per million. In the words of Beverly Pagan,
in other fields of science, we sometimes talk about gaps in our knowledge. Here, it's almost our knowledge is a little gap in our ignorance. We really know very little about exposure to these chemicals.
And so the women of the HOA decided to conduct their own health study, led by Dr. Pagan. Part of their study involved taking a map of the neighborhood and labeling the homes with color-coded pins. And they noticed patterns beginning to form. Cases of epilepsy here, birth defects over here. And it reminded Pagan of how she'd noticed the smells of the neighborhood got more or less intense depending on where you walked. But the clustering wasn't along grid lines, as in for a city sewage line or a water main. Instead, the pattern looked like something else that Dr. Pagan and Lois Gibbs seemed to recognize, because they'd recently obtained aerial photographs from the area in 1938, back when the canal was just a wide scar on the landscape and nothing had been dumped into it. As it turned out, the land was full of swales, tiny creeks that cut through the canal in every direction. One in particular was fairly large, starting on what was now 103rd Street and running across the canal to a stream that still existed in the northern part of the neighborhood. Placing these images over one another, Pagan and Gibbs began to develop a theory. Even if these swales had been filled, groundwater would still move through their old paths. This could explain why next-door neighbors sometimes experienced different health problems or none at all, while neighbors across the street had almost identical problems. It also reinforced what they already knew to be true, was that they weren't safe on this side of the fence because the chemicals were in the air and the water and everyone in the neighborhood was in danger.
Oh my God, I'm so surprised.
So shocked. It also explained why up north in the third ring, but directly next to that existing stream, John Allen Kenny seemed to get sick every time he returned home from the hospital that year, each relapse worse than the last, and why in October of 1978 he died at the age of 7 from an immune response disease called minimal lesion nephrosis, which Luella Kenny had been told was the best disease a child could have and that he would be over it by the time he was 14. Dr. Pagan and the women of Love Canal put hundreds of hours of research and analysis into their theory, and then Dr. Pagan presented the information about the swales to the state health department in Albany. And she felt like she was listened to. I mean, how could she not with this absolute bombshell of information? Dr. Axelrod from the state health department himself had gone head-to-head with Hooker and knew that their chemicals were pervasive and dangerous, so he had to be entirely on their side now, right? But when she flew back home, newspapers were already running articles where the state health officials spoke with the press. From the state's perspective, the data was a collection of anecdotes that fit a particular hypothesis, but did not quantitatively exclude any others. Without knowing what chemicals exactly were present and for how long and in what concentration, how long individual people were home on a given day, what they were personally susceptible to, etc., it was impossible to definitively establish causality. And so they disregarded Dr. Pagan's findings as useless housewife data.
Wow.
Yeah, direct quote. They even went so far as to say that these women in Love Canal simply didn't understand the nature of their miscarriages, and that perhaps they were just having problems with their IUDs or they were mentally ill.
I hate it here. I actually hate it here. Like to top off like what they're dealing with, let's call you a bunch of like hysterical housewives who are mentally ill and like couldn't bring a baby to full term. Like, the fuck?
Is it not?
And it's your fault. Like,
is it not just the story we've heard over and over again?
I know.
Where it's like people are being poisoned and they're like, how about some misogyny? Fuck off.
Wow.
Yeah. As luck would have it, the same time the women of Love Canal were being slandered for not knowing what was going on, their worries about remediation making things worse came to fruition. So maybe they know what they're fucking talking about. A tanker truck working on the edge of the canal on 97th Street sank into the ground and tipped over, spilling 500 gallons of rainwater and chemicals that had just been removed from the canal back onto the concrete on the safe side of the fence. Efforts were only momentarily ceased while a crane was retrieved to right the truck, and then they kept on digging like nothing happened. And then, health officials announced that dioxins, long suspected to be lurking in the waste, had been found in the canal.
About time? Question mark?
I mean, it's about time that, like, something made you concerned. Like,
right.
Does this toxic slurry not concern you unless it has dioxins in it? Because that's a little fucking problematic to me. But dioxins, they are a big deal. Like, if they didn't pay attention to dioxins, there was nothing they were going to pay attention to.
Right. Like...
And we discussed these in depth back in season 1 during the Agent Orange episode. Dioxins are a chemical byproduct that were never intentionally created, and they are extremely toxic. This is another group of chemicals that is referred to somewhat generally. But one of them, 2378 TCDD, is considered to be the most toxic anthropogenic chemical ever made, with an LD50 value of 0.6 micrograms per kilogram. Botulinum toxin is about a magnitude of order more toxic, reported in nanograms per kilogram, but this is what we are dealing with.
Right.
And it was found in Love Canal at concentrations of 1,400 to 5,100 micrograms per kilogram.
Fantastic.
And these are in
Fantastic.
soil. These are in soil, so that's soil concentration versus like the concentration of
in the body. Sure.
Yes, but it's
sure,
like,
but
how much of it's in the body, considering that this was in the fucking soil, you know?
Right.
In the soil where we grow our fucking vegetables. In the soil that kids are, like, you know, playing on and crawling around on and putting shit into their mouths. Like, huh. So, it really cannot be understated how much more tangibly dangerous the situation became once this was confirmed. I mean, the residents knew that it was dangerous, but once officials saw this, they were like, oh, fuck, God fucking damn it. But they still weren't doing anything. They weren't, like, immediately like, okay, immediate evacuation. They were still like, oh, well, you know, you're probably safe on the other side of the fence. So residents knew it was time to make a bigger splash. Their tiny protests and blockades hadn't been anything compared to what Aline Thornton and Lois Gibbs had planned now. If they were going to be forced to ring in 1979, still slowly dying above a toxic waste dump, they were going to make the lives of every man in power from Albany to D.C. complete hell. And they were going to get it all on camera, ensuring that images of burning effigies, child protesters, and EPA hostages is what would come to mind when anyone the world over thought of Love Canal. But that's a story for next time. So,
all right, I shall be patient, but I'm excited about this because, like, I'm kind of obsessed with Lois Gibbs right now.
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
She a baddie.
She is. A baddie. She's great. And she's going to become so unhinged in part 2. It's, yeah.
Yes.
Female rage, female revenge. Hell yeah. Hell yeah. That's what is coming. So that is going to be the next episode we put out. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you wait too long for it. But yeah, we had to break it up because I promised Venus I wouldn't do another Jonestown. So we're breaking it up a little bit.
No, I look forward to it.
And I know that we don't tend to have a whole lot of announcements that we give at the end of episodes. And, you know, we have the pre-recorded, like, go follow us everywhere. But I do have some big news that I was hoping I could share with our listeners.
Do tell.
Well, you know, I introduced myself as an author and toxicologist. And I am a fiction author. And I actually write fiction under a pen name. And I am having a novel coming out from Mad X Media in July of 2026.
Let's go. You are such a cool big deal. I cannot wait.
Thank you.
I'm so excited for you. Like, long time coming, and well deserved.
Thank you. I've been working pretty hard on it, and I have more stuff planned in the future. So head on over to our Instagram where you can get links to my pen name page, and you can follow me there for my journey. I'm sure I will become intolerable as the pre-orders and all that approaches. So
I cannot wait to tolerate all of it. I will tolerate all the things.
Well, thank you so much. Until next time.
Bye. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.